Dr. Pim van Lommel.
Vielen Dank. Und herzlichen Dank für die Einladung, hier heute einen Vortrag zu halten. Aber I will continue in English. First, I would like to thank the previous lecturer, because what he told you was a classical near-death experience, with all the aspects, not just an out-of-body experience, but just a full-blown near-death experience. So that makes it much more easier for me to continue. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very pleased that I get the opportunity to discuss here today my concept of non-local consciousness, based on scientific research on near-death experiences in survivors of cardiac arrest. A near-death experience, or an NDE, or an experience of enhanced consciousness during a period of apparent coma, still give rise to many unbelieving and critical questions, especially by physicians and neuroscientists. But, as already 1 century ago William James has said, to study the abnormal is the best way of understanding the normal. How can it scientifically be explained that people can have clear memories from a period of obvious unconsciousness? Or how is it possible that permanent life changes occur after cardiac arrest of only a few minutes? An NDE, or near-death experience, is the unforgettable confrontation with the unlimited dimensions of our consciousness. Quote, "It felt as if I had become another person, but with the same identity." Or another quote, "You can be physically dead, but your mind lives on. Only one thing matters, your attitude toward other people. I accept life as it is, and I am no longer afraid of death." I will not only talk about changes in consciousness during and after an NDE, but above all I want to discuss my ideas about the relationship between consciousness and the brain. Important questions for me were, how is consciousness related to the integrity of brain function? Is it possible to gain insight in this relationship? And is there a biological basis of consciousness anyway? We can distinguish between both temporary and timeless aspects in our consciousness. This prompts the following questions. Is it possible to speak of a beginning of our consciousness, and will our consciousness ever end? I realize that my approach will be new or unexpected for most neuroscientists, and that my conclusions will not always be in conformity with the currently widely accepted materialistic paradigm in Western science. And I also realize that many aspects of consciousness are still a great mystery, because as the well-known philosopher David Chalmers has said, consciousness, the subjective experience of an inner self, poses one of the greatest challenges to science. Even a detailed knowledge of the brain's working and neural correlates of consciousness may fail to explain how or why human beings have self-aware minds. Now, how started my interest in near-death experiences? In 1969, during my rotating internship, a patient was successfully resuscitated in the coronary care unit by electrical defibrillation. We mostly do not realize anymore that until 1967, less than 50 years ago, all patients with cardiac arrest died because modern resuscitation techniques like defibrillation and external chest compression were not yet available. But this patient regained consciousness after a period of unconsciousness of about 4 minutes. We at resuscitation team were very happy, but this patient seemed to be very, very disappointed. He told me about going through a tunnel, seeing a light, and also beautiful colors and hearing music. I have never forgotten this event, but I did not do anything with it. And in that time, I did not know that in human history the same experiences have been told in many cultures, in many religions, and in all times, as shown in this painting from 1480 by the Dutch painter Hieronymus Bosch, showing deceased people escorted through a tunnel to the light. And only years later, in 1975, Raymond Moody first described his so-called near-death experiences. And only in 1986, I read about his experiences. And from this moment, I started to interview my patients who had survived a cardiac arrest. And to my great surprise, within 2 years, 12 patients out of 50 survivors of cardiac arrest in the past told me about their NDE. So for me, it all started with scientific curiosity, because according to our current medical concept, it is not possible to experience consciousness during a cardiac arrest when circulation and breathing have ceased. I grew up in an academic environment in which I had been taught that it was obvious that consciousness was the product of a functioning brain. And up until that point, I had always accepted it as indisputably true. But now, the phenomenon of near-death experience raised a number of fundamental questions. How and why does an NDE occur? How does the content of an NDE come about? And why does a person's life change so radically after an NDE? I was unable to accept most of these answers to these questions because they seemed incomplete, incorrect, or unfounded. But first, what is a near-death experience? Some people who have survived a life-threatening crisis, as we heard now by an arterial blood loss during operation, they report an extraordinary experience. An NDE can be defined as the reported memory of a range of impressions during this special state of consciousness, including a number of universal elements, such as an out-of-body experience, pleasant feeling, seeing a tunnel, a light, deceased relatives, a life review, or the conscious return back into the body. And many circumstances are being described during which NDE are reported, such as cardiac arrest, clinical death, shock after loss of blood, like childbirth, complicated childbirth, coma following traumatic brain injury or stroke, near drowning, especially children, or asphyxia, but also NDE-like experiences are reported in serious diseases not immediately life-threatening, but also during depression, isolation, or meditation, or without any obvious reason. An NDE-like experience can also occur during the terminal phase of illness and are called deathbed visions or end-of-life experiences. So apparently you don't always need a non-functioning brain to report an NDE. The NDE is transformational, always causing enhanced intuitive sensitivity, profound changes in life inside, and the loss of the fear of death. This is why these kind of experiences are also called spiritual transformational experiences, or STE. And near-death experiences occur with increasing frequency because of improved survival rates resulting from modern techniques of resuscitation and from better treatment for patients with cerebral trauma. The content of an NDE and the effects on patients seem similar worldwide, across all cultures and all times. However, the subjective nature and the absence of a frame of reference for this experience lead to individual cultural and religious factors determining the vocabulary used to describe and interpret the experience. Children and adults, Christian and atheists, Muslims and Buddhists, they all use different words from their own religion, culture, and tradition. And according to a recent at random poll in Germany and the USA, about 4% of the total population in the Western world should have experienced an NDE. So more than 10 million people in the USA, more than 3 million people in Germany, and about 20 million people in Europe must have had a near-death experience. Now, why do we physicians hardly ever hear a patient tell about his NDE? Patients are so reluctant to share their experience with others by all the negative responses they get. Patients must feel that you trust them, that you can listen without any comment or prejudice. But for most physicians, the NDE is still an incomprehensible and unknown phenomenon. Once a conference was held about NDE in a university hospital with more than 300 people in attendance. And at the end of the conference, after several lectures about NDE, a man stood up and said, "I am a cardiologist for more than 25 years, and I have never heard such absurd stories. This is total nonsense. I don't believe one word of it." Then another man stood up in the audience and said, "I am one of your patients. I have had an NDE during cardiac arrest, and you would be the last one I would ever tell." They know exactly that this kind of doctors are not able to listen at all. Until recently, there was no prospective and scientifically designed study to explain the cause and content of an NDE. All studies had been retrospective and very selective in respect to patients. Based on these incomplete retrospective studies, some believed the experience could be caused by physiological changes in the brain as a result of lack of oxygen, cerebral anoxia. Other theories encompass a psychological reaction to approaching death, hallucinations, dreams, side effects of drugs, or just false memories. So in 1988, we started a prospective study of 344 consecutive survivors of cardiac arrest in 10 Dutch hospitals with the aim to investigate the frequency, the cause and the content of an NDE. And this cartoon was published in a Dutch national newspaper when our study was published in The Lancet in December 2001. We wanted to know if there could be a physiological, pharmacological, psychological, demographic explanation why people experience enhanced consciousness during a period of cardiac arrest. And we did a short standardized interview with sufficiently recovered patients within a few days of resuscitation and asked whether they could remember the period of unconsciousness and what they recalled. We studied patients who survived cardiac arrest because this is a well-described, life-threatening medical situation, which is also called clinical death. The definition of clinical death was used for the period of unconsciousness caused by lack of oxygen or anoxia of the brain due to the arrest of circulation and breathing that happens during cardiac arrest in patients with an acute myocardial infarction. And these patients will ultimately die from irreversible damage to the brain if cardiopulmonary resuscitation, CPR, is not initiated within 5 to 10 minutes. It is the closest model of the process of dying. And in cases where memories were reported, we coded the experience according to a weighted core experience index. And in this system, the depth of the NDE was measured according to the reported elements of the content of the NDE. The more elements were reported, the deeper the experience was and the higher the resulting score was. We found that 282 patients, 82%, had no recollection of the period of cardiac arrest, of the period of unconsciousness. However, 62 patients, 18%, reported some recollection of the time of clinical death. And of these patients, 41 patients, 12% had a core experience with a score of 6 or higher. And 6% had a superficial NDE. Now, which elements were reported? In our study, about 50% of the patients with an NDE reported awareness of being dead or had positive emotions. About 25% of the patients had an out-of-body experience. 30% reported moving through a tunnel. About 25% had communication with the light or had meeting with deceased relatives. 13% experienced a live review, as we heard now before, just in the previous talk, and 8% experienced a border. So in our study, all well-known elements were reported except a frightening NDE, but I know patients who had a frightening NDE. Now, what might distinguish the small percentage of patients who report an NDE from those who do not? We found to our surprise that neither the duration of cardiac arrest, 2 minutes or 8 minutes, nor the duration of unconsciousness, 5 minutes or 3 weeks in coma, nor the need for intubation in complicated CPR, nor induced cardiac arrest in electrophysiological stimulation, CPR, the EPS, had any influence on the frequency of NDE, and as a non-significant. The degree or gravity or the lack of oxygen in the brain, anoxia, appeared to be irrelevant. So a physiological explanation for NDE, like anoxia, could be excluded. Neither could we find any relationship between the frequency of NDE and administered drugs, fear of death before the arrest, nor foreknowledge of NDE, gender, religion, Christian or atheist didn't matter at all, or education. And we additionally performed a longitudinal study with taped interviews 2 and 8 years following the cardiac arrest of all late survivors with NDE, along with a matched control group of survivors of cardiac arrest who did not report an NDE. And this study was designed to assess whether the loss of the fear of death, the transformation in attitude toward life, and enhanced intuitive sensitivity is the result of having an NDE or just the result of the cardiac arrest itself. This had never been studied before in a prospective design. The NDE turned out to be a life-changing experience because only patients with an NDE did show this aforementioned typical transformation. In particular, they were less afraid of death and had a stronger belief in an afterlife. We saw them in greater interest in spirituality and questions about the purpose of life, as well as a greater acceptance of and love for oneself in combination with the feeling of oneness with others and with nature. The conversations we had in our longitudinal study also revealed that people, often to their own amazement and confusion, had acquired enhanced intuitive sensitivity after an NDE, or as many of them put them, they had acquired paranormal gifts. This enhanced intuition is based on interconnectedness with the non-local consciousness of others, and it's independent of time, in a knowing of future events or having prognostic dreams, and it's independent of distance, the sense of knowing about an incoming phone call, and of pain, illness, of upcoming death of people, which usually proves to be accurate. This sudden occurrence of this enhanced intuition can be quite problematic, as people suddenly have the very acute sense of others, which can be extremely intimidating. Finally, it is quite remarkable and a surprising and unexpected finding to see a cardiac arrest lasting just a few minutes give rise to such a lifelong process of transformation. However, the integration and acceptance of an NDE is a process that may take many years because of its far-reaching impact on people's pre-NDE understanding of life and value system. Despite the mostly positive experience, the NDE is also a traumatic event because there is hardly any acceptance by doctors, nurses, family and partner, with a divorce rate of more than 70%, which makes the process of acceptance and integration very difficult. And this process will take many, many years with strong feelings of depression, homesickness and loneliness. But the longer the interval between NDE and interview, the more positive changes are usually reported. Now, in 4 prospective studies with identical study design, our Dutch study, which is the only study with statistical analysis, 1 study from the USA and 2 studies from the UK, about the same percentage of NDE was found in a total of 562 patients who survived cardiac arrest. And all authors conclude that no one physiological or psychological model by itself could explain all the common features of an NDE. Bruce Grayson from the American study writes in his comment that the paradoxical occurrence of heightened lucid awareness and logical thought process during a period of impaired cerebral perfusion raises particular perplexing questions for our current understanding of consciousness and its relation to brain function. A clear sensorium and complex perceptual processes during a period of apparent clinical death challenge the concept that consciousness is localized exclusively in the brain. As Sampani and Peter Fenwick from the British study write that the data from several NDE studies suggest that the NDE arises during unconsciousness. And this is a surprising conclusion, because when the brain is so dysfunctional that the patient is deeply comatose, those cerebral structures which underpin subjective experience and memory must be severely impaired. Complex experiences, such as reported in the NDE, should not arise or be retained in memory. Such patients would be expected to have no subjective experience at all. Penny Sartori from the other British study concludes that, according to mainstream science, it is quite impossible to find a scientific explanation for the NDE as long as we believe that consciousness is only a side effect of a functioning brain. The fact that people report lucid experiences in their consciousness when brain activity has ceased is, in her view, difficult to reconcile with current medical opinion. So, with lack of evidence for any other theories for NDE, the concept, this far assumed, but never scientifically proven, that consciousness and memories are produced by large groups of neurons and are localized in the brain, should be discussed. How could a clear consciousness outside one's body be experienced at the moment that the brain no longer functions during a period of clinical death, even with a flatline EEG? Furthermore, even blind people have described veridical perceptions during an out-of-body experience at the time of their NDE. Scientific study of NDE pushes us to the limits of our medical and neurophysiological ideas about the range of human consciousness and the mind-brain relation. Before I discuss in greater detail some neurophysiological aspects of normal brain function and during cardiac arrest, I would like to reconsider certain elements of the NDE, and first the out-of-body experience, as we have just heard before. In this experience, people have veridical perceptions from a position outside and above the lifeless body. NDEs have the feeling that they have apparently taken off their body as an old coat. And to their surprise, they appear to have retained their own identity with the possibility of perception, emotions, and a very clear consciousness. And this out-of-body experience is scientifically important because doctors, nurses, and relatives can verify the reported perceptions, and they can also corroborate the precise moment the NDE with OBE occurred during the period of CPR or operation. In a recent review by Jen Holden and in the book The Self Does Not Die, more than 150 corroborated reports of potentially verifiable out-of-body perceptions during NDE were published. And it was found that more than 90% of the reported OBEs were completely accurate. Through verification, it was proven that all reported perceptions during coma, cardiac arrest, or general anesthesia were about details that really had happened. A small percentage contained only some minor errors, and only 2% was completely erroneous. And it proves that an out-of-body experience cannot be an hallucination, because this means experience and a perception that has no basis in reality, like in psychosis. Neither it can be an delusion, which is an incorrect assessment of a correct perception, nor an illusion, which means a misapprehensive or misleading image. What they perceived had really happened. A real out-of-body experience is clearly shown in this drawing by a 6-year-old girl who nearly drowned. It was in the United States, and resuscitated in the hospital. In this drawing, you see a happy and smiling girl up here, looking from above to her own resuscitation as she draws the external chest compression. A girl of 6 years old doesn't know anything about a resuscitation, CPR. And this is a report of a nurse of a coronary care unit. During night shift, an ambulance brings in a 44-year-old cyanotic comatose man into the coronary care unit. He was found in coma about 30 minutes before in a meadow. When we go to intubate the patient, he turns out to have dentures in his mouth. I remove these upper dentures and put them onto the crash cart. Only after about an hour and a half, the patient has sufficient heart rhythm and blood pressure. But he is still ventilated and intubated, and he is still comatose. He is transferred to the intensive care unit to continue the necessary artificial respiration for 1 week. And after more than a week in coma, I meet again with the patient, who is by now back on the cardiac ward. The moment he sees me, he said, "Oh yes, you know where my dentures are." I'm very, very surprised. Then the patient elucidates, "Yes, you were there when I was brought into hospital. You took my dentures out of my mouth and put them onto that cart. It had all these bottles on it, and there was this sliding drawer underneath, and there you put my teeth." I was especially amazed because I remember this happening while the man was in deep coma and in the process of CPR. It appeared that the man had seen himself lying in bed, that he had perceived from above how nurses and doctors has been busy with his CPR. He was also able to describe correctly and in detail the small room in which he has been resuscitated, where he was admitted in coma and had left in coma, as well as the appearance of those present like myself. And then the holographic live review. We also heard it before. During this live review, the subject feels the presence and renewed experience, not only of every act, but also of every thought from one's past life. And one realizes that all of it is an energy field which influences oneself as well as others. All that has been done and thought seems to be significant and stored, because one is connected with the memories, emotions, and consciousness of another person. You experience the consequences of your own thoughts, words, and actions to that other person at the very moment in the past that they occurred. Interconnectedness. Patients survey their whole life in one glance. Time and space do not seem to exist during such an experience. Non-locality. Quote, "All of my life up till the present seemed to be placed before me in a kind of panoramic, three-dimensional review, and each event seemed to be accompanied by consciousness of good or evil, or with an insight into cause and effect. Not only did I perceive everything from my own viewpoint, but I also knew the thoughts of everyone involved in the event, as if I had their thoughts within me. This meant that I had perceived not only what I had done or thought, but even in what way it had influenced others, as if I saw things with all-seeing eyes. As if your thoughts are apparently not wiped out." Think about it in a moment. Your thoughts are never wiped out. And all the time during the review, the importance of love was emphasized. Looking back, I cannot say how long this live review and live insight lasted. It may have been long, for every subject came up, but at the same time it seemed just a fraction of a second, because I perceived it all at the same moment. Time and distance seems not to exist. I was in all places at the same time, and sometimes my attention was drawn to something, and then I would be present there. And also a preview or flash forward can be experienced. People feel that they can see a part of their life that is yet to come. And again, it seems that if time and space do not exist during this preview, non-locality. And in a flash, I saw the rest of my life. I could see a large part of my future life, taking care of my children, my wife's illness, everything that would happen to me. I could see it all. One day I wrote down all the things I saw back then, and over the years I've been able to tick them all off. For instance, I saw my wife on her deathbed, wrapped in a white shawl, just like the one she was given by a friend of hers some days before she died. And it is also possible to come in contact with the consciousness of deceased persons, interconnectedness. Quote, during my cardiac arrest, I had an extensive experience, and later I saw, apart from my deceased grandmother, a man who had looked at me lovingly, but whom I did not know. More than 10 years later, at my mother's deathbed, she confessed to me that I had been born out of an extramarital relationship. My father being a Jewish man who had been deported and killed during the Second World War, and my mother showed me his picture. The unknown man that I had seen more than 10 years before during my NDE turned out to be my biological father. Some patients can describe how they returned into the body, mostly through the top of their head, after they had come to understand that it wasn't their time yet, or that they still had a task to fulfill. The conscious return into the body is experienced as something very oppressive. They regain consciousness in the body and realize that they are locked up again in the damaged body, meaning again all the pain and restriction of their disease. Quote, when I came to in my body, it was dreadful, so dreadful. The experience had been so beautiful that I didn't want to come back. I wanted to stay there. And yet I came back. From that moment, it was a real struggle to live my life inside my body, with all the limitations I experienced at the time. But later, I realized that this experience was in fact a blessing. For now I know that the mind and body are separate, and that there's life after death. And about all people who experience an NDE lose their fear of death. Quote, it is outside my domain to discuss something that can only be proven by death. For me, however, this blessing experience was decisive in convincing me that consciousness lives on beyond the grave, and I know now for sure that body and mind are separated. Death was not death, but another form of life. So we have to come to the surprising conclusion that in our study during cardiac arrest, all these reported elements of an NDE were experienced during an transient functional loss of all functions of the cortex and of the brainstem with a flatline EEG. But how do we know that the EEG is flat in those patients with cardiac arrest? And how can we study this? So many studies with induced cardiac arrest in both humans, like in threshold testing for ICDs, and in animal models, cerebral functions has to be shown to be severely compromised during cardiac arrest, with complete cessation of cerebral flow, causing the clinical findings of the sudden loss of consciousness, the loss of breathing, apnoea, the loss of all body reflexes, which is a function of the cortex, but also the loss of all brainstem reflexes, like the gag reflex, the corner reflex, and fixed and dilated pupils are clinical findings. And the electrical activity in the cerebral cortex, but also in deeper structures of the brain in animals, has been shown to be absent after 10 to 20 seconds, a flatline EEG. In an acute myocardial infarction, the duration of cardiac arrest is always longer than 20 seconds. So all 562 survivors of cardiac arrest in the 4 prospective studies must have had a flatline EEG. Now, the conclusion about conscious experience during a flatline EEG is often called impossible and unscientific. The quite proposed objection that a flatline EEG doesn't rule out any brain activity because it is mainly a registration of the electrical activity of the cerebral cortex misses the mark. The issue is not whether there is any brain activity of any kind whatsoever, but whether there is a measurable brain activity of the specific form regarded by contemporary neuroscience as a necessary condition for conscious experience, with visible activities in many neural centers, the so-called global neural workspace. And it has been proven that there is no such specific brain activity at all during cardiac arrest. So it is indeed a scientific challenge to discuss new hypotheses that could explain the possibility to have a clear and enhanced consciousness during a transient period of a non-functioning brain, with memories, self-identity, with cognition, with emotion, and the possibility of perception out and above the lifeless body. To explain the reported interconnectedness with the consciousness of another person and of deceased relatives. To explain the possibility to experience instantaneously and simultaneously non-locality, a preview and a review of someone's life in a dimension without our conventional body-linked concept of time and space, where all past, present and future events exist, and even to explain the experience of the conscious return into the body. Most materialist scientists still don't believe in the possibility to experience and enhance consciousness during a period of a non-functioning brain. And they try to debunk everything I have said and written by simply stating that it is obvious an NDE must be produced by the brain. They only change their mind as soon as they have experienced an NDE themselves, like Eben Alexander and other physicians. So my advice to these debunkers is try this small and dangerous footpath and find out yourself. A recently released book, Consciousness Beyond Life, which was a bestseller with more than 250,000 copies sold worldwide, and which was published in Germany as Endloses Bewusstsein. I have written that based on prospective studies of NDE, based on recent findings in neurophysiological research, and based on concepts from quantum physics, our consciousness cannot be localized in a certain time nor space. This is called non-local consciousness, beyond time and space. And in this concept, our endless of non-local consciousness with declarative memories finds its origin in, and is stored in a non-local realm, just as wave fields of information. And the brain only serves as a relay station for part of these wave fields of consciousness to be received into or as our waking consciousness. The function of the brain should so be compared with a transceiver, a transmitter-receiver or interface, exactly like the function of a computer. Different neuronal networks function as interface for different aspects of our consciousness, and the function of neuronal networks should be regarded as receivers and conveyors, not as retainers of consciousness and memories. And in this concept, non-local consciousness is non-rooted in a measurable domain of physics, our manifest world. However, the physical aspects of consciousness, which originates from the wave aspects of our consciousness through collapse of the wave function, objective reduction, can be measured by means of neuroimaging techniques like EEG, fMRI, and PET scan. And with this concept of non-local consciousness, all reported elements of an NDE during cardiac arrest could be explained. Now, in trying to understand this concept of interaction between non-local consciousness and the material body, it seems appropriate to compare it with modern worldwide communication. There's a continuous exchange of objective information by means of electromagnetic fields for radio, television, mobile telephone, or laptop computer. And at this very moment, we are invaded by hundreds of thousands of telephone calls and hundreds of radio and television programs. But we become only aware of these electromagnetic informative fields at the moment we use our mobile telephone or by switching on our laptop, radio, or television. And what we receive is neither inside the instrument nor in the components, but thanks to the receiver, the information from the electromagnetic fields, the cloud, becomes observable to our senses, and hence perception occurs in our consciousness. Internet with more than 1 billion websites can be received at about the same moment in the USA, in Europe, and in Australia, and it's obviously not located inside our laptop, nor is it produced by it. Information from internet is always and everywhere available because it is stored in the cloud. This concept can be compared with non-local consciousness. Since the publication of several prospective studies on NDE in survivors of cardiac arrest, with strikingly similar results and conclusions, the phenomenon of NDE can no longer be scientifically ignored. It is an authentic experience which cannot be simply reduced to imagination, fear of death, hallucination, psychosis, the use of drugs, or oxygen deficiency. And people appear to be permanently changed by an NDE during cardiac arrest of only some minutes duration. According to these studies, the current materialistic view on the relationship between brain and consciousness held by most physicians, philosophers, and psychologists is too restricted for a proper understanding of this phenomenon. Materialistic science starts principally from a reality that is only based on physical, observable data. But we should be aware that besides external and so-called objective perception and observation, there are also subjective, not observable and not demonstrable aspects like thoughts, feelings, inspiration, and intuition. We can only measure the electrical, magnetic, chemical activities in the brain by EEG, MEG, and PET scan, and we can measure changes in blood flow in the brain by fMRI. But these are only neural correlates of consciousness. These measurements do not explain anything about the production nor about the content of consciousness. With our currently available scientific and objective techniques, one is not able to even prove, measure, objectify, nor falsify the content of the subjective experiences in our consciousness. Direct proof about how neurons or neuronal networks could possibly produce the subjective essence of our thoughts and feelings is totally missing. By making a scientific case for consciousness as a non-local and this ubiquitous phenomenon, this view can contribute to new ideas about the relationship between consciousness and the brain. Another 5 minutes I need. So by making a scientific case for consciousness as a non-local phenomenon, we must question the purely materialistic paradigm in science. And so it seems to be important for our scientific ideas about the mind-brain and mind-body relationship. It's also evident that it's important for our concepts about life and death, because of the almost unavoidable conclusion that at the time of physical death, consciousness will continue to be experienced in another dimension in which all past, present, and future is enclosed. Quote, "Death is only the end of our physical aspects. I believe now that death, like birth, may be a mere passing from one state of consciousness into another. However, we should acknowledge that research on NDE cannot give us the irrefutable scientific proof of this conclusion, because people with an NDE did not quite die, but they all were very close to death and without a functioning brain. So it has indeed been scientifically proven that during NDE, enhanced consciousness was experienced independently of a functioning brain. And quoting from a recent death announcement, "All what you have falls into decay, but what you are lives on beyond time and space." So we have a body and we are conscious. Without a body, we can still have conscious experiences. We are still conscious beings. Recently, someone with an NDE wrote to me, "I can live without my body, but apparently my body cannot live without me." The NDE seems to be a personal rediscovery of wisdom and insight that is ages and ages old and has been well known in many cultures and in old times. But nowadays it seems forgotten. I would like to quote Plato, who wrote more than 2,000 years ago, "The temporary material body is the temporary carrier of our immortal soul, and time does not exist in the immaterial world," according to Plato. So based on scientific research on NDE, I cannot avoid the conclusion that endless consciousness has been and always will exist independently of the body. There's no beginning nor will there ever be an end to our consciousness. Our enhanced consciousness resides not in our brain and is not limited to our brain, because our consciousness is non-local, and our brain has a facilitating and not a producing function to experience consciousness. We desperately need a new post-materialist approach in science to accept these new concepts. But nowadays, new ideas are usually ridiculed and neglected. As the physician Ian Stevenson, who published a lot about reincarnation, once stated, "It has been said that there is nothing so troublesome as a new idea." And I think that is particularly true in science. Science, for me, is asking questions with an open mind. Science should be the search for explaining new mysteries, rather than stick with old concepts. I believe and hope that in the near future, modern science will include empirical research and unusual subjective experiences that may occur in our consciousness, and that we accept non-local concepts to understand how we are interconnected with each other and with our endangered planet. I realize now that everything originates from consciousness. As Max Planck, the founder of quantum physics, has said, "I regard consciousness as fundamental. I regard matter as derived from consciousness. We cannot get behind consciousness. Everything that we talk about, everything that we regard as existing, postulates consciousness." And as quantum physicist Jude Currivan has stated, "We, our consciousness, and all things in the universe are non-locally connected with each other and with all other things in ways that are unfettered by the hitherto known limitations of space and time." I now understand that people create their own subjective reality based on their consciousness and create their intention one lives his life. We should recognize that our view of the world is wrong, because we do not realize that the world as we see it only derives its subjective reality from our consciousness. Because it is only our consciousness that is determining how we perceive this world. When we are in love, the world around us is beautiful. When we are depressed, our world is like hell. When we are frightened, made terrified by the press and by politicians, our world will be full of terror. The mind in its own place and in itself can make a heaven or hell, wrote John Milton even in 1667 in his poem, Paradise Lost. So regarding what we can learn from people who are willing to share their NDE with others, I would like to quote Dag Hammarskjöld. "Our ideas about death define how we live our life. Because as long as we believe that death is the end of everything we are, we will give our energy toward the temporary and material aspects in our life. In our short-sightedness and sometimes willful ignorance, we forget to reflect on the future of our planet, where our children and grandchildren will have to live and survive. We forget about sustainability, as we are now destroying and exhausting systematically our planet just because we are living in a competitive and materialistic society. We should stop thinking and acting as if we are better than others, because this will always be at the expense of children and other weak and delicate creatures around the world. We should realize that the harm we cause to others and to nature ultimately is harming ourselves, because we as humans are not only intensively interconnected and tangled with each other, but also with animals and plants living on our endangered earth. I hope that in the near future we will accept non-local concepts to understand how we are and always will be interconnected with each other also after physical death. That we have to change our personal consciousness, not only to change the way we live, but also to change the way we want to treat, honor and respect people who are willing and able to share their NDE with us. Their lives changed in a ways they were not prepared for. And they all tell us that they fundamentally changed their ideas about life and death, because you can be physically dead, but your life lives on. And another quote, "Death was not death, but another form of life." Consciousness seems to be our essence. And once we leave our body, leave our physical world, we exist as pure consciousness, beyond time and space, and we are unfolded in pure, unconditional love. As a woman with an Andy wrote to me, when the power of love becomes stronger than our love of power, our world will change. And it will require a huge change in consciousness indeed. And we should feel all the responsibility for this change. Thank you for your attention. Thank you.